Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, with Sheldon Richman, FFS vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspectives on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, this month is fundraising time for the Future of Freedom Foundation. As you know, we're asking people to consider supporting our work, much of which is funded here at the end of the year by people who make donations to FFF. And so I thought we would discuss the methodology that the Future of Freedom Foundation employs and has utilized for some 23 years now, because, we often get comments from people that, how come you guys are so radical? How come you're so uncompromising? Think about the broad base of support you could get if you just simply called for reforming government programs like the income tax. We call for abolishing the income tax as compared to just reducing income tax rates. And we call for the separation of education in the state instead of, leaving education to state and local governments. Why do we do this? And so I thought we would address that, as well as the methodology we use and why we consider it so important. And, I'll start out by saying that, we consider principles of critical importance. That's why we deal with these uncompromising perspectives on the burning issues of the day, because principles cannot really be compromised. And Leonard Reed used to point that out, the president of the Foundation for Economic Education. They can only be abandoned. And that if people see the principle involved in a particular aspect of libertarianism, then it's easier for them to grasp libertarianism itself and to understand why it is that those of us who advocate libertarianism do. Because of that importance of principles. So, for example, in the income tax, we're not interested in reducing the rate by which the government's taking people's money. We're interested in a free society, and freedom necessarily entails keeping everything you earn and you decide what to do with it. And so obviously the corollary of that is a separation of charity in the state, where people are free to decide for themselves whether to be charitable or not. And we believe in freedom. We believe that in a free society, people will respond in a way that where they care for their fellow human beings. They'll just do so in a way that they believe is appropriate, as compared to the government forcing people to do this. What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, I think it's important that we be sort of portraying the ideal, because the chances are much of the change, maybe not everything, but much of the change will end up being in terms of some kind of increment, hopefully large. But we want to make sure the increments are moving in the libertarian direction, and that can't happen if no one is laying out what the ultimate goal is. Otherwise, it's adrift. It could be going in different directions, and people won't know if that's a good or bad thing. We're trying to teach people that the right society is a free society. So if there's going to be changes, it ought to be going in that direction. And yet, like I say, if there's nobody sort of painting the picture of what the ultimate ideal is, then how would anybody know what direction things should move? So I think we're performing a very important job in this whole libertarian effort.
Yeah, and that raises an interesting point, is that how would ever anyone think about a particular libertarian ideal if everybody plays the reform game? I mean, you've written this great book for FFF, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, which essentially calls for a separation of education in the state, the way our ancestors separated religion in the state in the Constitution. We're sometimes receive criticism on this, saying, oh, that's just too radical. Why don't we instead try to, move education down to the local and state level, abolish the National Department of Education? Well, if everybody that purports to advance a free society talks in terms of school vouchers and having the states in control of education, how would anyone ever think of the idea that, hey, there's a different approach here, a total separation of school and state, if people aren't going to be advocating it? And that's what we do. We raise people's vision to a higher level. so that they then can then start thinking about that particular idea.
No, that's right, and we do that across the board, and we do it in terms of what we think the good society is, which means that there's no agency, no individuals initiating force, and if somebody does initiate force, then there are proper remedies for that. But otherwise, people are left free to live the lives they want to lead. And I agree with you that if no one is setting that out, it certainly makes it hard to judge any proposal somebody might have. So, either things are going to happen incrementally or they're not, or they're going to happen rather rapidly. If they're going to happen rapidly, again, we want people to know what the moral ideal is. And if it's going to happen incrementally, we also want people to know what the moral ideal is so that they'll know whether any given incremental proposal is moving that way or not. So whatever your view of social change is, right, all at once or by transition or a huge leap, either way, we need people to generally know what the moral ideal is. So I think we're covered on both cases there.
Yeah, and I think that it's very possible that people gravitate toward an ideal case, a certain segment of society gravitates toward the ideal case versus the incremental change. And a good example of this is with respect to the Federal Reserve. People could have just taken the position that, abolishing the Fed is just too radical. People have never embraced that, so we've got to just figure out ways to rein in the Fed, have them raise the money supply by a certain percentage each year, and so forth. But as you know, the Libertarians and the Austrians have said, we don't need a central bank. It's inconsistent with the principles of a free society. It's very destructive. Better approaches the free market. And lo and behold, Ron Paul, of course, brings that up in the political campaign, and people started, gravitating toward that ideal. I mean, you can even, people on the left were talking about end the Fed. And I think it's a good example of how people can see the underlying principle of an ideal case, and which causes them to embrace it as compared to just making the case on some minor reform level.
Right. I think it does inspire people to see what the ideal is and to give the case for that and to teach them that that it works. And that therefore it's worth striving for. I think that's much more of an idealistic thing, and people are very often are motivated by ideals. I mean, Murray Rothbard liked to say that no one was going to undertake a great effort that's going to take up a good part of their lives on behalf of 10% more bathtubs being produced a year. In other words, a moral ideal does light a fire under people in a way that simply a few points on the GDP or something like that will probably not do. So I think there's a strong case for a moral movement that makes this case across the board and in big terms, holistic terms, that a free society is a good society.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, the great ideals in history, have been achieved because of that moral case and that ideal case. When you look at due process of law and religious liberty, the freedom of speech, these are ideals that people were able to see were morally correct, and they would adopt them. I mean, look at religious liberty. If we had been living under a regime of compulsory attendance laws for churches and sending the kids to church every Sunday, and the idea that we need to make people moral. And then, we come along and we say, hey, let's just abolish this whole system. Let's separate church and state. I think, a lot of people would have a difficult time with that. Well, what do you mean? You mean people wouldn't be required to attend church? I think because they'd be so accustomed to it. Well, we now know that religious liberty is the right way to go, and people are accustomed to it as part of our heritage. Well, it's the same obstacle we face with respect to the regulated society, the welfare state. People have been born and raised in this kind of system where people are coerced into being good and caring with, welfare programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and we've sort of lost this confidence in the market process and the confidence in a free people. And so, the same principle applies. We need to be addressing that ideal, as you say, pointing to what the goal line is. That the goal line is a free people where they have as much liberty on what they do with their money as they do with respect to what they do on Sundays. And some people might not use their money in ways that other people approve of, but that this is the moral case, that people should have the right to do that. And, oh, by the way, we also address the utilitarian case, that freedom produces higher standards of living. It nurtures, such values as care and compassion and responsibility and independence, rather than coercing people into adopting them. And that's, of course, what we do here at FFF. We address both the moral case, the ideal case, concentrating on the principles, as well as the utilitarian case as to why this is so beneficial.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is that the utilitarian case is part of the moral case, in my view. I don't believe there's a separation. I mean, a society that will enable people to advance themselves, prosper, acquire the goods that make their lives easier and more pleasant is a moral case. So I'd rather not see such a separation in dividing this up between moral and utilitarian. After all, the utilitarians, for one thing, were presenting that as a moral philosophy. And while I don't regard myself as a utilitarian, I think pointing out the good consequences of freedom is part of the moral case. So that little dissent there, not a huge difference maybe between the two of us, but I would say those are both part of the moral case. Moral case has maybe two sides to it.
Well, what I was referring to was you'll recall that Milton Friedman once said that if presented with a case where freedom resulted in a lower standard of living, he would still choose freedom because freedom's that important, even if the results are not as satisfactory as they are under coercion or socialism and so forth. And so his point was that, hey, this is ideal, but as you point out, we live in a universe in which, you have a consistency here. Freedom does produce good results. Unfortunately, we don't have to make that choice.
Right. That would be a very different world. I mean, there are people that like to play around with these hypotheticals, so-called thought experiments, and say, if a free society, somebody did it recently, if a free society was going to lead to 10% very poor, 80% at subsistence, and 10% very wealthy, would you still be a libertarian? That would be a totally different universe with different laws of causality. I don't think I have to choose because it doesn't really make much difference. But, I'd be a little less enthusiastic about freedom if I thought it was going to create misery for hundreds of millions of people. I mean, who would not be? Who would not care about that? But that's a moral case too, and consequences are built in at the ground level to a moral case, at least as I approach these things. So I don't see that there's this big divergence, that there's this need to choose, would you be for freedom even if the results were going to be terrible? Because that's, like you say, thankfully that's not the world we live in.
Well, and I've often said that well, let's talk about methodology a little bit as to how do we get people to embrace this philosophy. Because, there's a lot of despondency sometimes I gather in the movement where people say, the state is too big and things are getting too bad and we don't have a chance. What's the point? And they've been, fighting in these vineyards for many, many years. And so it's easy to think, oh, my gosh, what's the point? And so I think we ought to talk about that a little bit as well, that, we believe in the power of ideas, that ideas matter. I mean, why do we write articles? Why do we give speeches? I mean, the presumption is because these things have the ability to change the world. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the world into a better place by adopting principles that we say will better mankind. And so how do you do that? Well, you do that through the dissemination of ideas, and there's no way to measure them. We believe that we can put ideas out in the marketplace, let them go, and don't worry about the results so much. That if it's a good idea, it starts to transmit across society. Sometimes it'll go across society like wildfire, very unexpectedly. But it's not so much that you're trying to convert people, because I don't think you can really convert people. It's really the way I've come out on this thing is we're really looking for people that are receptive to libertarian ideas, or we're planting seeds that are for people that are searching for a better way. And that with that type of methodology, the finding libertarians, planting seeds, that we hope to reach a critical mass in society that can then overcome the status. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, I think people need to listen to your encouraging words, because you're right. Without that, it is easy to get despondent. I mean, I'll name a couple of things, not in order to cause the despondency to increase, but just for realism. There's talk about the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage again. Now, if we date the modern movement from the end of World War II, I think that's fair. The founding of the Foundation for Economic Education in 1946. Minimum wage has been one of the most talked about issues by libertarians and free market people generally. And yet here we are in 2013 with lots of people favoring a raise in the minimum wage. I just saw an NBC poll that said that nearly half the Republicans and nearly half the self-identified Tea Party advocates are in favor of raising the minimum wage. So if you only think about stuff like that, there may be grounds for despondency, because we haven't made progress on that. I like to say that if you go out on the street with a clipboard, do it today, go on a busy street, stop everybody and say, would you sign a petition to put a raising the minimum wage on the ballot in November? I guarantee you'll get the whatever signatures are required by your state. If you have a referendum in your state, you'll get 10,000 very quickly. People will do it. Maybe they just want to impress you by saying, oh yeah, I'm not a Scrooge. Do it around Christmas especially. I'm not Scrooge. I'll sign it. People will sign it. And then in November, they'll go and vote for it. And that happened, in 2006, I think it was, where it passed on several state ballots. So if you concentrate on stuff like that, you can get despondent. I will name one more thing. We had this recession in 2008, of course, which was a combination of, stimulation of the housing market by government policy, we had this huge collapse, and I would say, unfortunately, that the free market and libertarian narrative has not carried the day. Most people think there was a lack of regulation of banks, even though there's been this huge infrastructure built up, libertarian and free market infrastructure in the media and in universities and like FFF, organizations that have built up over the years, and we're ready with an explanation. Very good, very fine work being done by lots of different people and organizations explaining why this crash occurred. And yet I guarantee most people would not say, yeah, it was the government's fault if you went out and asked them. So we have a lot of work to do, but I agree with you about why we should not be despondent. I know maybe I'm talking at cross purposes with myself here, but despite those things, there are reasons for encouragement. First of all, we can find things going on that will encourage us, like marijuana being legalized in 2 states without not medical marijuana, but actual marijuana for use by anybody. Those things we can look at and say, well, we just need to fan those embers and turn that into a flame.
Yeah, you bring up some great points. I mean, that point about the minimum wage is really kind of intriguing and kind of amusing, because we really have been working hard for decades. As you say, FEE was founded in 1946. They were publishing stuff on the minimum wage through the 40s and 50s and 60s on up. And yet here you have, a large portion of the population still favoring minimum wage laws. And I'm sure that people back in the early days of FEE were saying, well, we really don't have a chance right now in the short term, but we're working for the long term. Well, we are there long term. And I hear libertarians today saying, well, we don't have a chance today, but we're working on we're investing in the young people so that they can have freedom later on, like 40 years from now, and they're 60. Well, I don't really care that much about achieving freedom 40 years from now. I want to achieve freedom in my time. And I want to, that's my objective here. That's the objective of FFF, not to advance freedom 50 years from now, but to do so now. and have freedom in our time. And I think there's a lot of reason for optimism here. Tons of young people are discovering libertarianism, and I see them as an asset, not for some future, 50 years from now achieving freedom, but helping us achieve freedom in our time now. And just because people have not seen the fallacy of the minimum wage up to now, you never know when all of a sudden libertarians reach a critical mass that can then shift society. And that can be right around the corner when people least expect it. That's the power of ideas. This is why totalitarian dictators try to shut these kind of presentations down, because they know that ideas can break through. And one of the areas that I think, Sheldon, that we got a great shot is with respect to the poor. That if the poor can be made to see why the minimum wage law hurts them so bad, black teenagers in the inner cities where there's a 40% unemployment rate, if they can see all of a sudden that libertarianism is the key, you abolish the minimum wage, you can start, competing at lower wage rates. You can open up businesses, hiring friends. You ditch the income tax where now the poor can save more of their money. They can start up businesses with a little bit of a nest egg, a capital, get rid of all the regulations and the licenses that are nothing but a protection racket for the well-established, wealthy businesses. Then all of a sudden we got a shot at this thing. And that just comes through whose arguments are the most persuasive, which is the most powerful. And this is what we do. Here at FFF, we present these arguments with the hope and the confidence and the faith that these ideas are being transmitted into the marketplace and hopefully reach people that are the biggest victims. And I think the biggest victims of this whole welfare state regulated economy way of life are the poor. And finally, let me just say that I think one of our biggest obstacles is that Americans have been taught that this is free enterprise, that they're living in a free enterprise system. So when you have a big housing collapse, or like you were talking about, they automatically think, failure of free enterprise. And, of course, that goes back to Roosevelt's New Deal era, where they blamed the whole Great Depression on the failure of free enterprise and said that this new way of life, the welfare state and the regulated economy, was to save free enterprise. And I think that's where a lot of young people are now coming to libertarianism. They see that we're speaking the truth, that we have a grip on reality, that socialism and welfarism and regulation and so forth, the drug war, that this is not freedom at all. And, of course, the whole military empire warfare state is not freedom. And I think as people are starting to see that, we are building our numbers that I think can bring a shift in society very quickly and very rapidly and very unexpectedly.
Yeah, on the minimum wage, I think there's something we should learn from these decades now where, after all that work, the argument is whether the minimum wage should be abolished. The argument's over whether it should be raised or not. That's not a good showing. And I think the lesson there is we won't win that if we argue purely on the minimum wage. We won't win that one. Our job, and you suggested it already, our job is to broaden that, to show that the minimum wage is at most a symbolic gesture by the power elite to make it look like they care about low-income people, when meanwhile they maintain all of these what I call toll gates on the road to personal advancement, all the licensing, all the taxes, all the regulations, everything that makes it close to impossible for someone who's already gotten a rotten education because of the government schools to start a business. And to combine with friends and family and start some sort of home enterprise. They can thumb their nose at a low-income job at that point at Walmart or McDonald's. That's what they need. They need alternatives, not the promises to make a Walmart job better or a McDonald's job better. That's the way. That's noblesse oblige, right? That's what the privileged do to show that they care. Okay. We'll pass a law saying those employers have to pay you more. Never mind the consequences of losing the job or those jobs not being created in great numbers and substitution of machines for people. All those consequences will follow. But even if they didn't follow, even if it produced a slightly higher wage for those people. It just locks them into those kinds of jobs. Why don't those people who claim to care about the poor so much look radically at all of the obstacles to personal advancement? They never talk about that, and that goes for organized labor too. When's the last time they've talked about licensing or the taxes and regulations that are much tougher on a would-be entrepreneur than an existing business, that gives all the benefits to the incumbent firms and all the disadvantages to someone who has an idea in his head who might like to give it a shot, except there's zoning and there's all kinds of regulations that keep them from starting a business. Or look at the way even street vendors are harassed and regulated out of existence. Atlanta, for example, recently signed a monopoly contract with some big company, which then told all of the existing vendors, you now work for us, and we need, I don't know what it is, $500 a year if you want to continue working. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people who care about the poor and low-income people would be talking about. And so just notice who never talks about that. Instead, they just say, oh, yeah, let's raise the minimum wage to $10.10, and they never talk about anything else. Now you know who the real phony champions of low-income people are.
Well, absolutely. It's just a great big racket. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of people that making big money off this stuff, like public housing, where there's, we're helping the poor with public housing. Well, it's really, look at all the contractors that are out there, making bids for these government projects to build public housing. I mean, that's what it's all about. People are making money off this thing. And the other thing is when they ask to be judged by their good intentions, especially liberals or progressives, they all want to be judged by, we're trying to help the poor. That's our aim. Well, forget good intentions. We've lived for how many, 80 years now with this welfare state, or actually even longer, going back to the Roosevelt administration. Let's look at the actual consequences of their programs. I mean, all they tell us about is how much poverty there still is in America. Well, to me, that's the best proof you could ever have that the war on poverty has failed. The fact that you have to continue waging it because there's so much poverty. And so their whole system is a bad system. It has hurt those at the bottom of the economic ladder. And so I think, again, we have to hit that utilitarian case. We got to show people, especially the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, this is what they have done to you with their licensing, permits, regulations, zoning, minimum wage laws. They have done damage to you. They've locked you out of the labor market. And then, throwing you into the welfare system where you stay there for the rest of your life dependent on the government dole. But again, what we do here at FFF, we raise people's vision to a higher level, to think in terms of the principle of economic liberty, that people have a right to enter into mutually beneficial transactions with one another on whatever wage they decide, on whatever terms they decide, because it's through trade that people raise their standard of living. They're giving up something they value less for something they value more. That people have a right to sustain their lives through labor, to do that through occupations and professions and businesses without getting government permission, simply because that's what freedom is all about.
Well, that's right, and I agree with you that there's a huge vested interest in the current system. You have lots of people, middle class bureaucrats who have comfortable livings, running these programs. You got lots of academics who get the right studies and do 10-year studies, and which gets them big bucks, at least for an academic, big bucks. And so there's like any vested interest, they're going to protect it. They're going to put the best spin on it. They're going to say this is a vital program that can't be done away with. We know it's a joke. We know from the great work of Jim Bovard that government training programs are boondoggles. They have multiple ones. You would think just from the standpoint of duplication, there wouldn't be so many. But of course, everybody's got each one has a group of vested interest that don't get rid of it, and they don't do any good anyway. And Bovard has written repeatedly, including in our publication, Future Freedom, about what a joke they are, and yet they keep going because the people that live off them they're never going to get rid of them. And this is the same thing over and over again. They don't do what really needs to be done. If you cared about income inequality, and I think you could debate whether those numbers are faithful or not to the facts. I think there's a lot of serious problems with those statistics, but if you care about that, it seems to me you'd be looking for all the ways that government builds barriers to people making themselves better off. And then it's just amazing how there's no interest in that. Zero interest. They pick on one thing, living wage or minimum wage or possibly union representation. But even if they got that, and even, like I said, even if there weren't the bad consequences that we can demonstrate there are from having a minimum wage and particularly raising it at this time, it really wouldn't do what needs to be done. It would not be the radical solution that would give people freedom and an open road, a more or less open road, or much more open road, to personal success than their little raise in the minimum wage.
Well, and on all these, mainstream talk shows and stuff, they accept the premises of the welfare state regulated society. And then they argue within the context of that particular paradigm. And hardly any time do they break out of that and say, hey, how about a society with no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, a total free market in healthcare, a total charitable system where you honor your mother and father on a voluntary basis, where families take care of families, communities take care of communities on a voluntary basis, not through the tax system. You very rarely see that because everybody's operating in these mainstream talk shows within the parameters that you've got to accept that here we have a Federal Reserve System and a welfare state and a regulated economy and the drug war, and you've got to come up with ways to reform it. Well, I say nonsense. That's not what freedom is about. Their paradigm, to me, Sheldon, is finished. And we can look at what they have produced, the damage they've done, and that there's a growing sector of society that is looking at this thing skeptically and saying, hey, there's got to be a different way. And they're discovering libertarianism, and that's why we've got to continue presenting this uncompromising case with the pure ideas on liberty. Now, in the last minute that we have left, I just want to, bring people's attention to that we've got this great conference that we're doing in February. It's a conference within a conference. We're doing it at the Students for Liberty Conference in Washington, D.C. at the Grand Hyatt, February 14th through the 16th. We've got it on our upcoming events section of our website at fff.org. We're going to be doing some more promotional material on it. But we've got the best conference within a conference that you can ever imagine on civil liberties and the national security state, which our longtime supporters know we have taken a leading role in, especially since 9/11. We've got the greatest lineup. We've got a panel consisting of Oliver Stone, that Oliver Stone, the Hollywood director, 3-time Academy Award winner, with his collaborator on his Showtime Untold History series, Peter Kuznick, and Jeremy Scahill, who's got this fantastic documentary film called Dirty Wars and a book of the same name. That's going to be in the main ballroom. They're expecting some 1,600 people there. And it's not just limited to students. Anybody can come, and the registration fee is nominal, like $35 or something. So we want to invite y'all to come, and we've got a lot of other speakers, Stephen Kinzer, Jamil Jaffer from the ACLU, Jonathan Turley, the famous attorney at George Washington University, and on and on. We're going to do Libertarian Angle there with Bob Higgs, Sheldon, myself. We got Scott Horton, and he's doing a panel with John Glazer. I mean, we got the greatest lineup you can ever imagine. And like I say, it's open to the public. I hope you guys will attend. In any event, we're doing our best, as everyone knows, to advance liberty, to achieve a free society in our time, not just 50 years from now. We need your support. Our work depends on your support. These conferences, these programs, the Libertarian Angle, Future of Freedom, our journal, FFF Daily. We need your support to make it happen. And so I hope you'll consider making a generous end-of-year donation here, tax deductible. We'd greatly appreciate your support. So thank you very much for tuning in. Continue to have a happy holiday season, and we'll see you next time.